The time has come to tell the truth.
I'll wake up and smell the coffee.
Today is the beginning of a new chapter.
Another future's possible, but we've got to fight for it.
Order!
Hello and welcome to the Debated podcast. As always, I'm your host, Will. And in this episode, I'm delighted to be joined by Bea Martinez-Gatell to discuss her new book, Swoon, Fangirls, Their Idols, and the Counterculture of Female Lust, from Byron to the Beatles. Welcome to the podcast, Beatrice.
Thanks for having me.
It's wonderful to have you on. Now, the first question I'd like to ask is, what made you want to write this book in the first place?
So this has been many years in coming, this book. I was a fangirl. I mean, I am a fangirl by nature. I get excited and obsessed by things, be it a movie, a book, whatever. But my kind of big fangirl moment was, and you will age me now, Leonardo DiCaprio and Titanic. So when I went to university, I studied film. I ended up writing my dissertation on Leo and female fandom. And while I was researching that, I came across a really interesting article by Barbara Ehrenreich about Beatlemania. And it said, if you look at a picture of Beatlemania out of context, all these girls in the streets in the 60s screaming and shouting against police officers, you might think it was women's lib or something. This was by her and two other women who had actually been there at the time. And they talked about Beatlemania kind of being part of their feminist awakenings, which I thought was completely fascinating. I also knew that female fandom didn't start in the 60s, as maybe we kind of think it did. So I decided to start tracing this line back. And it turns out this kind of trend actually starts in the 19th century with Lord Byron.
And I think that the way that you trace it throughout the decades and the centuries is great, and it really shows the evolution of it as kind of as a developing phenomenon, and not sort of like, you know, just kind of like isolated incidents. But how did you make the choice as to the particular individuals and the particular fandoms that you selected for the book?
So I wanted to look at the 6 moments when there was most mass hysteria about one person, kind of the Beatlemania of its era. So the most mass hysteria. And what's really interesting is these kind of became really clear. So each time, so if you look at Beatlemania, they're referencing Elvis. And when you read Elvis, they're referencing Sinatra. When Liszt happens in the late 19th century, they're referencing Byron. So actually, the kind of material made itself clear.
Yeah. And I think as well, there's a very interesting kind of like cross-section, isn't there, between these particular moments and the changes in sort of like the political rights for women and a kind of like a evolving sort of like feminist movements. To start with the first case, Byron, what was it that you think about Lord Byron that kind of sparked off this initial sort of interest in him, this kind of like fandom, the sort of like the fangirls that he gained?
So Byron is really the first celebrity in the way that we know it today. I think there had been other celebrity poets and writers, but he was writing in this very autobiographical way about the depths and torments of his soul. And suddenly people were reading his poetry and felt like they knew him. And I guess when you feel you know someone, you want to connect with them. So they started writing him letters. And it sort of exploded from there. He started playing on the fact that people felt that they knew him. I mean, I've been thinking about it so much recently. There are so many similarities with Taylor Swift, really. He played to his audience and sort of developed this character in response to what they wanted from him. And it was kind of a virtuous circle, really.
Yeah. And as you say, he just kind of like play up to that description that Caroline Lamb gave to him of bad, you know, mad, bad and dangerous to know. And that's something that I think that is very interesting in kind of particularly when you think about the sort of like the letter writing and the kind of like the encouragement of the sort of like of the fandoms towards him. Was it a case that a lot of people have described Byron as kind of the original bad boy? Was that kind of part of it, or was it just the sort of like the emergence of kind of like dark gothic writing at that time, and his image worked so much with it.
I think it was kind of a perfect crucible of all of these things happening at once. So yeah, there had been a few years earlier, there had been this massive trend for Gothic fiction. And really women's literacy was really taking off at this point in a way that was completely new. So we had lots of female readers loving Gothic fiction. Byron was a bit of a bad boy, but actually, you know what? He was, to begin with, he was more of a weirdo than a bad boy. And actually then once he realized that bad boy is what people wanted from him, he sort of lent into that a bit more. And then go into this in depth, but this idea of kind of reforming rakes and that sort of love story comes from Pamela and Samuel Richardson, which had been successful kind of a few years earlier as well. And he was sort of a reformable rake in real life. And when you read their letters, they're so fascinating. They are 50% sort of wanting to save him, but then also, and this is the part that people don't like forget about, they are 50% saying, I'm just as tortured as you. I can be your friend because I understand you.
And do you think that that kind of like that relatability and feeling that you could write to someone who was kind of like considered a sort of like a not just a public figure but a great writer was something very new about the age as well? That if you think of some of the sort of like the kind of great, writers of the past like Shakespeare or Milton, they weren't accessible in the same way that Byron was, or seen as kind of like a public creative figure in exactly the same way.
Right. And I think also, I mean, books were suddenly more widely available. So more people were able to access his work. And then, but I'll tell you what, when you read the letters, they feel very conflicted about writing to him. Like one of my favorites, she sent him a letter kind of gushing. And then a week later, she sends another letter saying, oh, I'm so sorry. I'm so embarrassed. What have I done? I don't know why I did this. Please forgive me. And sort of there's this real anxiety. They are kind of compelled. And I think part of this idea that he was supernatural and a vampire or whatever comes from this feeling. Today we call it parasocial relationships, and I kind of maybe have a problem with that term, but they feel this connection with a person they don't know, and they cannot explain the fact that they want to connect with him, but they cannot help themselves. That kind of was the most fascinating thing of that era, I would say.
Absolutely, and it also coincides, doesn't it, with a kind of like, you've got the emergence of sort of like Enlightenment thinking and it becoming more popular during this era. You have the vindication of the rights of women as well at this same sort of time. Do you think that as society changed, and particularly with the kind of like the freeing up of Europe in the sort of like in the post-Napoleonic era, there was this kind of sense of the world opening up more and this greater freedom that women were able to kind of attain that hadn't been the case previously?
Completely. Although I would actually say, I think that the kind of political changes more fed into anxieties about how women felt about him. But at the same time, life was changing. This was kind of one of the first eras where you might choose who you married for love. I mean, look at Jane Austen, right? And so suddenly the idea of the self is really emerging. So wanting to see yourself in the person that you marry is completely new. Before you would have just been, I don't know, a pawn in the marriage market for dowry or something.
And do you think there's also perhaps a sort of like a class element to this as well? That sort of like some of the people who were kind of like the initial fans of Byron tend to be from kind of better backgrounds, better financially stable backgrounds than perhaps later on when we're discussing later when you've got like with the Beatles and Sinatra, you've got women across the spectrum who are able to engage with their sort of like their work.
So I'll tell you what, Byron is fascinating, and he actually goes through the process that every cool pop star has gone through since, where phase one, it was kind of an elite. It was kind of his peers who read him. And slowly over time, he became more accessible. And for more working class people, Byron then became kind of a symbol of learning and betterment. So in the Victoria era, Byron was still really popular, but the kind of cool kids didn't want to like Byron anymore because he was too popular. So I think that's really quite fascinating. He made a certain type of writing and literature kind of exciting and accessible to a whole bunch of new people.
Hmm. And also there is, sort of like clearly both with his personal life and with his writing, a sort of like a kind of like a darkly sexual element to it, isn't there? And like, was that something that sort of was seen as new, and was that part of his appeal as well?
So it was. So I don't know if how much of this kind of like the sexual side
Hmm.
was there. I don't know how much of it we have kind of superimposed
Hmm.
backwards. Um, the fear was female sexuality, and the fear was that, and this comes from the revolution in France and kind of emerging feminism-ish, that if women could read, since women were quite hysterical, they might become excited by books. And whoever had written these books, if they were a handsome, charismatic leader, they might follow this person. And, danger could ensue. So it was sort of this like this kind of convergence of people thought that men read with their minds and women read with their bodies. So if they were being excited by books sexually-ish, that it could lead to basically, yeah, a French Revolution in the UK. UK?
Yeah.
Britain.
Yeah. And of course Byron himself is associated with revolutions as well when he goes off to Greece and is part of the movement to try and free Greece from the Ottoman Empire. Was that something as well that kind of added to his mystique in a way, do you think, that he was seen as not just someone who was very literate, but also in a way portrayed as kind of a man of action as such, even though the action wasn't he wasn't quite as active
I
as
know.
perhaps, yeah.
It was mainly going to the costumes shop and buying an outfit. But so I think it fed into the fears. But with the women, honestly, I think with his female fans, it was really mostly about this is a man who has adventures, but also has a really tender heart, and I could save him and love him, and he is like me, and kind of classic romance.
Yeah. And I'd like to turn now to Liszt because I think Liszt is a particularly interesting case because Byron, I think the general public will automatically associate with this kind of, and the Beatles and Sinatra as well. But Liszt, perhaps, I think maybe a lot of the members of the general public would not be aware of the kind of furore that he caused. Could you sort of explain what it was and what kind of like was at the cause of it?
Okay, so Franz Liszt was a pianist. His hero was Byron, actually. So in the mid 19th century, he had fans. Really, this was the first time that fans were meeting their hero or seeing their heroes in person. So crowds and crowds would come and see him. They collected souvenirs. People would weep at his concerts, like proper hysteria, and it was called Listomania. And really, this idea of mania at that time was really considered a lot more like a disease than we would consider Beatlemania now. So there were real concerns about what he was doing to people.
And it's also very interesting, isn't it, that Liszt is active at a point when you do have real fears of revolution in Europe, and you do have this kind of like this real fear of societal unrest, and you have sort of, contemporaries of his like Wagner who are again associated with these very political movements, and Wagner has to flee Germany because he is
Right.
so associated with that kind of politics. Do you think that this was a moment, but both in Liszt and sort of like in a broader sense, when music was really being seen as something that was making a very political statement and could be dangerous in of itself?
So I think it's less music and more celebrity.
Hmm.
So, this is the time of Napoleon. Napoleon's fighting wars and commanding people's attention. And we have Heinrich Heine complaining that all Liszt has to do is come on stage and like flip his hair around and play piano. And suddenly he's commanding crowds and crowds, like just as much as Napoleon. And that's terrifying when power has historically come from kind of kings or military might. To have it come from being pretty and good at piano is really terrifying. And actually, when we look at the sway that celebrities have now, we kind of see that their fears were not completely unfounded.
And do you think that you mentioned that Liszt wanted to emulate Byron, had this love of Byron? Do you think he was also playing up to the fact that Byron had attracted this following, and that was something that was conscious with him as
I think
well.
s- I would say so. And so Byron was pretty scornful of his female fans. He like collected his letters and saved them and read them in secret, but in public said he didn't write for women and no. List, on the other hand, he put female fans, he had a circle of ladies on stage with him. He really played up to the idea of being a ladies' man, perhaps a sort of, I mean, in those days, genius was associated with male sexual potency. So to have these women around him was a sort of symbol of his genius in a way.
And do you think as well that that kind of demonstrates the sort of the changes that were occurring in the way that celebrities were marketing themselves in some ways, that this was sort of the beginning of a period when had Byron obviously, but he was sort of scornful in a way of his fans, whereas Liszt seemed to want to play up to his audience in some ways. Do you think that this shows an evolution of the kind of the way that celebrities were sort of thinking about marketing and how they could inflame public opinion, how they could draw attention to themselves?
Completely. And I think they all pretend they don't. Even Liszt pretended he didn't, but he did. And what's really fascinating and what I was not expecting to find as I was researching this book is really how important female audiences in particular were in the birth and evolution of early pop culture. So with early popular classical music, and we count Liszt as popular. It was in salons that he first made his name, and those were run by women. So actually, pleasing the ladies, amazing story. It said, Liszt loves the ladies, but he bows particularly low when the lady has money, and of course because these were his patrons. And in times and places where women had really little kind of power and autonomy in these small places, like choosing who you put on at your salon or what matinee idol you want to go see at the theatre. These were small moments where they could have sort of ownership.
And do you think as well that as we're seeing in this context, there's kind of like greater economic power that women are slowly being able to gain? Obviously, it is still incredibly limited as compared to today, but do you think that that also played a sort of like a significant role that as the 19th century progressed, as women were winning more social and political and economic rights, that was playing into the kind of the power that they felt that they could be the patrons.
Completely. And, by the time we get to the late 19th century, where we have the theatre, which had historically been kind of like a tavern where you would just come to hang out with your male friends and get prostitutes. Suddenly, women start attending the theatre without chaperones because for the first time they're able to, or working women start attending the theatre as well. And so female patrons are much more steady and engaged. And so theatre owners start catering directly to them. Men left the theatre and turns out they decided to spend their time at legs shows instead. But yeah, so suddenly, as soon as women have a tiny bit of freedom and a tiny bit of money, they start getting kind of more cultural power in this really fascinating way that appears to have nothing to do with politics. It's entertainment, but really it does.
And of course, it shapes the sort of like the entertainment world, doesn't it? Because as you say, the sort of like the kind of the attempt to make the theatre much more respectable and something that is not as kind of like seen as as slightly dodgy in a way, kind of changes the reputation of actors, and it sort of in a way makes the theatre and certain performers become much more powerful in their own right and have an influence on sort of like wider society, kind of like the likes of Henry Irving, for example, and the emergence of the sort of the actor manager as a bit more of a respectable profession in the late 19th century. It seems to very much come from that economic power that women have going into that period, and to be able to make it a much more respectable kind of profession.
Exactly. And I think that, I mean, It's not, it didn't kind of turn out as respectable as they hoped. When they started, they were putting on morality plays, and pretty soon they realized women wanted romances, melodramas, and sort of gritty, realist problem play tragedies where everyone dies at the end. And then, but the fact that these kind of pretty boy matinee idols emerge, it's like a bit worrying if these people are being held up as kind of the paradigms of masculinity that women want. This is women what women want to see. It kind of becomes, and I think this is where we really see this kind of bifurcation that we still have, where there's kind of serious actors who do Shakespeare, and then the non-serious actors who are the idols of women who play in romances and are pretty and really just play on their looks, which is, I mean, they're handsome, but there's a kind of lot more complexity going on.
Yeah. And do you think that there is in society still this sort of effort to kind of like make that side kind of like divide almost seem permanent? I mean, for example, one actor who sort of springs to mind is kind of Robert Pattinson recently, an actor who was labeled very much in that sort of like pretty boy, quote unquote, kind of genre when he was doing the Twilight films, and then subsequently now he's doing things with like Robert Eggers and the sort of like the much more overtly serious type of quote unquote serious type of films. Do you think that that's something that is just a problem that's inbuilt in society that's difficult to challenge, or do you think that it's something that is manufactured and is sort of sustained by certain people in the entertainment industry?
So I guess there are two things going on. I guess one is they don't want to be teen idols or whatever. My boy Leo went through exactly the same thing. You know, it was Titanic and Romeo and Juliet. And then suddenly there's like a playbook now of how to do it. It was all mob films, and every film he made during his transition period, his face halfway through the film would be like beaten and damaged, as if to say, so by the end he'd be kind of like ugly and bloated and scarred, like I'm not a pretty boy anymore. But at the same time also, as these men get older, they kind of can't play those romantic roles in the same way. I mean, Sinatra went through it as well. His fans were teenage girls, but by the time you're like pushing 40, you do need to find something different to do. But you know, romantic films for 40-year-olds and 50-year-olds could exist. So I think it is a lot about wanting to be taken seriously, and you cannot be taken seriously if you are kind of a romantic hero. I don't think really that type of actor really exists anymore. There are male stars who occasionally star in romantic films, but no one who like Rudolph Valentino, I would say, was really the first and the last. It went so badly for him that no one wanted to try that ever again.
And do you think you're touching on Sinatra there as well? Do you think that with his emergence in kind of like in the post-war era, it's sort of like just before the war and then growing particularly to success in the post-war era, do you think that that was kind of a symbol of how much the world had changed through the Second World War? The Second World War was a transition moment, not just in regards to the sort of like the fight against fascism, the sort of like the political transformation, but also very much a social transformation in terms of how kind of like male celebrities were able to market themselves and the kind of engagement that they got from female fans across the spectrum.
Completely. So I suppose Sinatra really is the first teen idol. He was young, his fans were young, and he sold this really youthful, romantic view of himself before the war and during the war. I think, but I think what's most interesting nearly about all the men in this book is they begin as stars for teenage girls or women, and then something about them often, then they start appealing to men. But something about what made them appeal to the young women is still there. So in the kind of dark, complicated post-war years, Sinatra gives male fans, who then become his majority of fans, a way to feel and express emotions in a way that would not have been possible before the war. So, so these stars kind of become stars as kind of flashpoints for all the kind of social and kind of emotional changes of their moment, I would say.
And you also have that kind of that fascinating, as you touched upon before, with the kind of like the transition from being seen as the sort of like the teen idol to kind of like the the kind of appealing more to men. You have that kind of like crossover point a bit with Sinatra and Elvis, don't you? When the pair of them are both working at the same time, and Elvis is emerging much more to take Sinatra's mantle, and it's something that Sinatra was not very happy about, was it? It was something that he sort of kind of resented a bit, I think.
Oh yeah, what did he? I wish I knew the quote. Like he called him some like disgusting aphrodisiac of
Yeah.
the likes that had never been seen before. Exactly. So, and I guess we still see it now. There are just these cycles. The new ones come up, scare everyone, because that is the other thing that I hadn't fully kind of understood until I was researching this book, that these men terrified the elders of the girls, and the female fan responses as well. The fact that women were sort of openly expressing desire for men at times when you had to be a good quiet girl and just prepare yourself for marriage was actually quite shocking. And this was behavior. I mean, Elvis is really the peak of this, but it's happening a little bit in Sinatra, where swooning for Sinatra and sort of fainting in the street became a kind of a form of self-expression, which was completely new and just baffled psychologists and parents. So yeah, it was terrifying.
And there's also this, I think, interesting point as well in terms of that both Sinatra and Elvis were influenced by African American culture in the US, and the kind of like the music that they listened, particularly Elvis, of course, was influenced by a lot of black singers, a lot of African American singers. Do you think that that added something to kind of like the fears that particularly the sort of the kind of like the white ruling elite of the US felt at the time in regards to their performances and their music, because it was associated not just with kind of liberation in terms of sexuality, but also sort of like crossing racial barriers in some ways?
Completely. And that is what, I mean, it wasn't just Elvis. This is what rock and roll was. Rock and roll really, it was African American inspired music that was bringing young people together, often physically dancing in like dark, sweaty dance halls. And we can talk a lot about or ask ourselves about Elvis and appropriation, but he was appropriating black fashion, black haircut, black music. So for there to be a white boy who was bringing these things to white girls was what was nearly most terrifying about him. But I guess that has to be put in the context of the kind of desegregation in schools. There were black rock and roll stars who had masses of young white female fans hugging them and asking to spend time with them after performances. So suddenly music and pop culture becomes the melting pot that kind of people feared. I had not known about people like Chuck Berry. I found that completely fascinating.
Yeah, and you have sort of like, I think, a real moment when this kind of like also crosses the sort of like the Atlantic when the Beatles arrive, and there is kind a sort of like a cultural shock for them. I think that that's something that is also fascinating, that they kind of, I think it was John Lennon who said that they thought it was so weird when they started playing America, because it was almost like they'd gone back to the 50s in time, in a lot of the areas that they were playing in, how sort of like toned down everyone was, how sort of like buttoned up and kind of like repressed the sort of like the dress was. Do you think that something that's sort of a theme throughout this book is the sense that all of these kind of like idols have an element of otherness to them, and that is sort of like part of both the appeal and the concern that a lot of people are feeling?
Completely. And I think it works on kind of a few different levels. I think at each historical moment, this otherness is sort of for their girl fans really expressing a desire for something new or something different. So, I mean, Valentino is the best example. He's kind of a Italian, in inverted commas, effeminate dancer who likes jewelry, and suddenly he becomes the biggest pinup of the day. But what he represents to the women of his era is a man who cares about their feelings, who like wants to have good sex with them. You know, this is completely new, and these are the ideas that are swirling at the time. So these men become symbols of it. Same with Sinatra. What he represents may look traditional to us, kind of 2.4 children in the suburbs, but to the girls, it was not only that kind of domestic life. It was a domestic life with a man, again, who cared about their feelings, who listened to them, who wasn't just going to kind of make them cook and leave the house each day. And then by the time we get to the Beatles, it's kind of their songs really are about reciprocity and equalness in a really fascinating way that it's easy to forget if you're not listening to them on repeat for 6 months.
And I think as well, one of the things I thought was really interesting in the introduction of the book is you mentioned going to see the Baz Luhrmann film, Elvis.
Yeah.
And that obviously has quite an interesting depiction of fangirls and that kind of that link between fans and Elvis. How do you think directors who are sort of like looking back, particularly male directors, often view that kind of phenomenon? And do you think that they perhaps misunderstand it? Because I think you see in other films like the Rat Pack film about Sinatra and the Rat Pack. I think you also have similar scenes like that there, which seem perhaps, sort of like not reflective of the truth of the situation.
Right. Films, documentaries. The fangirl is an accessory. She's sort of a kind of background screaming creature that exists to kind of reflect her male star's power. Like he's made it. When you see the screaming girls outside, you know our hero has made it. We sort of forget that it's those screaming girls and their money that has made this person a star. That these men, we can call them geniuses. We can go back to the 19th century view of geniuses as kind of these legends of male sexual potency, but really they're performers, and their job is to, as their careers were beginning, was to entertain young women. So I don't think we should forget that. And I guess that was why I really wanted to write this book. To these girls and women are always there, but we never sort of consider what's going on in their minds or what these men represented to them.
And the way that the broader media at the time, I think, presented fangirls, particularly as the sort of like the press and television became more and more influential, also has an impact on the way that we sort of like look at them, don't we? And to what extent do you think that there was a concerted effort by those in the press to kind of portray them in a particular way because it fit the sort of narrative of, as you say, the kind of like we know the hero has arrived because all these screaming girls
That's such a good question. I mean, I don't think these male journalists even thought that much about it. I think in List's day, what is fascinating is he had male and female fans, both kind of driven to deep expressive emotions. We have male music critics writing in their diaries that they ran home from his concerts in floods of tears and their lives would never be the same. But that was considered sort of connoisseurship of his genius rather than silly, frivolous fandom. So the female fan becomes this sort of symbol of the way that art is becoming sort of desecrated and too popular, and people who don't really understand are being silly. Where the male, even with the Beatles, even today, female Beatles fans talk about the fact that they feel that they need to hold their own with male Beatles fans and like know their stuff and prove that they understand everything just as well. And I think that's a bit silly. I think we should ask ourselves why men on YouTube are making 6-part videos about, what really happened with Yoko Ono. That, that it's the same. They just have different rules.
It absolutely is, and I think as well. What I always think in that regard is you take someone like Nietzsche, who was such a massive fan of Wagner and had this incredibly sort of like devoted relationship with him, and this kind of like love and hate, and it was like writing when he felt that Wagner had written things that were weren't in keeping with his idea of what Wagnerism was, but yet we don't view Nietzsche in the same way that we sort of like might with the quote unquote screaming fangirls. We just see him as the kind of like the serious philosopher and thinker, and not someone who had this really very deep love for Wagner.
That's so fascinating. I think that I was asking myself a lot of the time, well, right, especially the early chapters with Byron, like where is the line between fan and like influence? Virginia Woolf,
Mhm.
obsessed with Byron. There's a part in her diary where she had like not wanted to read him, and now she's finally been reading him, and she says, "Today I've fallen in love with Byron." You know, that is emotion. Or the Brontes, we don't call them Byron fangirls, but like a lot of their writing, you know, we could call it Byron fan fiction potentially, but we don't. We call them geniuses as well. So I guess it comes down to whether someone has done something with their fandom as opposed to just enjoyed it.
Yeah. And I think that that's particularly interesting to think of in a modern
Hmm.
context because, we obviously have so many different fandoms that are, all over the kind of like the internet that vary from, people who are fans of things like Twin Peaks to Taylor Swift fans and sort of like a very broad spectrum of fandom that exists. Do you think that the way that we look at fandom and the way that we look at fangirls is kind of changing at all with the internet? Do you think that it's changing, or do you think we're still kind of stuck in this idea of the sort of the stereotypical screaming fangirl?
So interesting. I think that it's kind of an accepted part of life now. Fans and, you know, stars understand the importance of fans, and actually, fans are more powerful because they are able to connect with their idols directly and sort of put pressure on them in ways that is occasionally unpleasant. But but then I think that we are still dubious of fans. I think firstly because people ask me a lot about the dark side of fandom and you
Mhm.
know the like self-harm or like bullying. And I would say that that is it does happen, but it had always happened. But we remember and give spotlight to the more troubling stories, a sort
Mm.
of scaremongering, when actually, for every Taylor Swift fan who does something worrying, there are probably 10,000 who just enjoy jumping on their beds and listening to her
Mm.
songs. Which sort of links to this everyone wants me to call fandom parasocial relationships. And I can't really, because that to me, and maybe this is going to be controversial, but that's like going back to listomania. That's saying that this thing that has been going on for centuries is sort of the thing that we need to medicalize, when actually it's this oddly natural human process. I don't know what you
Mm.
call it. My favorite fangirl from the whole book is called Isabella. She's writing to Byron in the early days of his celebrity, and she says, like, I don't know what to call this. I think about you all day, every day. You're in my daydreams, but it's not love. But what is this thing? And I think this thing is fandom, and it is a response to mass culture. But I don't think we should medicalize it.
No, absolutely, and I think it's sort of fascinating, isn't it? That particularly, obviously we're talking about female sexuality as well. That is something that has often been medicalized, and that
Hmm.
particularly in the past, they sort of like need to see it almost as a disease rather than just as a natural thing. Do you think that's part of the reason that there is this kind of like this link because of the way that there had been this sort of like medicalization in the past of female sexuality and the link that was sort of made between appreciation and sort of like being a fangirl to it, and there was that kind of like unfortunate intertwining of the two.
Yeah, yeah. I think it's actually links more to our fear of emotion. I mean, we live in the age of wellness and self-care and therapy, but actually, in some ways, we still fear emotions in all their complexity. And actually, I think that's probably why people actually like people like Taylor Swift. And this goes back to the very earliest days of fanaticism, the English Civil War, where emotion in people could lead to revolution. So you don't want to see people feeling emotions in public about a public figure because they could do something bad. And I think that so when we fear the emotions that people are feeling about a celebrity, yeah, it's less about sex and more about just emotions in general, I think. And it is not just women anymore, it's kind of men and women for sure.
We're coming towards the end of the podcast, Beatrice. It's been wonderful to have you on, but I do have one final question for you. For anyone who has either read the book or is going to read the book, what one thing do you most want them to take away from the book?
Um, that it was women who created pop culture in the way that we know it today.
Well, I think that's an excellent thing to take away from the book, and that's certainly something that I took away from it as well. Thank you once again for taking the time to speak to me on the podcast.
It has been such an awesome chat. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the podcast. If you've enjoyed it, you can subscribe to us on iTunes, Spotify, Podbean, and Amazon Music. You can also follow us on Twitter, @DebatedPodcast, like us on Facebook, Debated Podcast, and if you'd like to get in touch with us, whether about appearing on an episode of the podcast or commenting on an episode that you've listened to, you can do so at thedebatedpodcast@gmail.com. Thank you for listening. I hope you listen to the next one.